Imagine a dusty 12-year-old boy knocking on a door, desperate for water. His clothes were dusty, his shoes worn out, and his voice soft from exhaustion. But the moment the door opened and Gazika Alisa staring at a face she buried 12 years ago, the glass slipped from her trembling hand and shattered on the floor. Her knees gave out and tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Oh my God, how is this possible? This moment would change everything." That single knock wasn't just a plea for water. It was a wound from her past, torn open again after 12 long years of grief. Hello friends, welcome to Oyam's African Tales. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of hidden potentials, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel.
The love Ngazika Alisa still held for her lost son, Obinna, was a living, breathing thing, a phantom limb that ached with a constancy that defied time. For over a decade, it had been the sole, suffocating tenant of her small house on the edge of Ozizikere. This was a town where the wind carried whispers as easily as the scent of pine, and everyone knew Ngazika's story. The woman who had lost her husband and a baby in a tragic car accident, her world shattered into a million irreparable pieces. They said she never recovered, and they weren't wrong. Some whispered she still set a place for both at the dinner table every night, a silent, reverent offering to a memory. They weren't wrong about that either. Every morning she sat by the window, a teacup held tight in trembling hands, her gaze fixed on the dusty road that ribboned past her house, as if waiting for a miracle to materialize from the shimmering heat haze, for her sun-kissed boy to come laughing home. Life had become a quiet echo of memories, each one a pang, a caress, a relentless reminder of what was stolen. A mother's heart, once bursting with noisy joy, had been reduced to a fragile, vibrating string of perpetual sorrow. This afternoon was no different. The sun, a weary orange orb, dipped low, painting the sky in melancholic hues. The wind sighed through the pines, carrying the ever-present scent of old memories, weaving them through the fabric of her present loneliness. Ngazika was mending a torn sleeve, the rhythmic push-pull of her needle a small, futile attempt to piece back together her own unraveled existence, when a sound, impossibly delicate, fractured the profound silence. A faint knock on the door. It was hesitant, almost apologetic, as if unsure of its right to disturb the sacred stillness of her grief. Ngazika frowned, her brow furrowing with a mixture of annoyance and a strange, unbidden spike of premonition. Visitors were rare, and certainly unwelcome. She wiped her hands on her apron, her movements slow, heavy, before pushing herself up and walking to the door. Her heart, a muscle she usually felt only as a dull throb, began to beat with an unfamiliar quickness, a frantic flutter against her ribs that whispered of impending change, or perhaps impending pain. She pulled the door open, sunlight spilling across the threshold, and there he stood. A boy. His hair, the color of sun-faded wheat, was a wild tangle, his face smudged with streaks of dirt, like a miniature warrior returned from some unseen battle. His clothes, thin and threadbare, offered little protection against the chilly wind that now whipped around them both. But it wasn't his disheveled state that stole her breath. It was his eyes. Deep gray, with a startling fleck of blue, they were the exact same eyes she had seen every single day, staring back at her from the framed photograph of her lost son, Obinna, on her bedside table. The same mischief, the same innocent vulnerability, the same flicker of a soul that had once been hers. A gasp tore from her throat, stolen by the sudden, suffocating weight of history. "Ma'am, may I please have some water?" the boy asked softly, his voice a reedy whisper, barely audible above the wind. He clutched the strap of his torn backpack, his small knuckles white. For a second, Ngazika couldn't move. Her heart felt not like it had stopped, but like it had begun to beat an impossible, frantic rhythm. The rhythm of life, of a love she thought was long dead. Her world tilted, the solid ground beneath her feet dissolving into a shimmering mirage. Obinna, her Obinna, standing on her porch. It was impossible. He was gone. She blinked rapidly, her eyes burning, trying to steady herself, to discern reality from the cruelest of hallucinations. "Water," she repeated, the single word escaping her lips, raw and trembling, laced with an agony and a hope she hadn't known she still possessed. The boy nodded, his head bobbing slightly. "Yes, ma'am. I was walking from the bus stop to the orphanage down the road. I got tired and thirsty." Orphanage. The word pierced through the fog of her shock, tethering her back to the present, yet doing nothing to diminish the impossible ache blooming in her chest. An orphanage. A boy alone, with Obina's eyes. It was a twist of fate too cruel, or too miraculous to comprehend. "Of course, sweetheart. Come in. Sit down. You look exhausted," Ngazika managed, her voice still an unsteady tremor, but imbued now with an ancient, fierce maternal instinct that roared to life within her, shaking off the dust of 10 years. She motioned him inside, her hand shaking as she reached out, almost involuntarily, to brush a stray lock of hair from his brow, a gesture she hadn't performed in over 10 years. Her fingers lingered, tracing the soft skin, feeling a warmth that was frighteningly real. He stepped inside timidly, his worn shoes leaving small, dusty prints on her meticulously clean wooden floor, each mark a silent declaration, a disruption of her solitary order. The air in the house, once stale with grief, suddenly vibrated with a fragile, almost terrifying possibility. She moved through the kitchen in a dream, her hands fumbling slightly as she poured him a glass of cold water. As she handed it to him, her fingers brushed his, and a jolt, electric and profound, shot through her. A silent scream of recognition tore through her mind. He drank slowly, thirstily, his throat bobbing with each gulp. And as he did, Ngazika couldn't stop staring. The shape of his nose, small and slightly upturned, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he paused, a nervous habit she knew so well, the slight curl of his lower lip when he concentrated. Every tiny gesture mirrored Obina. Every single one. And then she saw it, glinting beneath the smudged dirt on his left cheekbone, a tiny white scar, almost invisible, but utterly unmistakable. The scar from when Obina, at 4 years old, had tumbled off his tricycle onto a gravel path. Ngazika's breath hitched, a silent sob catching in her throat. It was impossible. And yet, she felt an ache in her heart that she hadn't felt in years, an ache that was not of grief, but of a terrifying, overwhelming recognition. It was the ache of a love reawakened, a love that threatened to consume her, to rewrite everything she thought she knew about loss and life. The silence in the small house, once a sanctuary of sorrow, now buzzed with a dangerous, exhilarating suspense. Just as she was about to ask, to shatter the fragile silence with the question that screamed in her soul, the boy finished his water, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked up at her, those familiar gray-blue eyes wide and earnest. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his small voice echoing in the too-still room. "What's your name, dear?" she asked, her voice a soft tremor that seemed to stir the dust motes in the air. "Nduka," he said, his voice a low mumble against the rim of the cup. "Nduka Okonkwo." Okonkwo. Ngazika's heart plummeted, then soared again, entangled in a whirlwind of doubt and desperate hope. It had been 12 years. She whispered, the name a ghost on her tongue. It was her maiden name, a name she hadn't spoken aloud in decades, a name belonging to a life that felt utterly separate from her present. Names could change. Memories could fade. But those eyes, that scar, that could not be a coincidence. Her hands trembled, her gaze fixed on the boy, the impossible, miraculous boy who looked so utterly, undeniably like her lost son. Who was he truly? Her grip tightened on the armrest of her own chair, knuckles white. And what untold story lay hidden behind those familiar eyes that now blinked up at her with innocent gratitude? The answers, she knew, would either save her or break her entirely. "Yes, ma'am," Nduka continued, oblivious to the seismic shift he had just caused. "My mom said that's my real last name before I was adopted, but I don't remember her. She passed away when I was a baby." The words hit Ngazika like a physical blow. The delicate glass water she held, a treasured heirloom from her own grandmother, slipped from her trembling fingers. It hit the polished oak floor with a sickening shatter, scattering shards like broken dreams. Tears, hot and scalding, welled in her eyes, blurring the elegant room into an indistinct watercolor. She fell to her knees, not from physical weakness, but as if the ground itself had given way beneath her. She covered her mouth with both hands, a muffled sob escaping, a sound she hadn't allowed herself to make in 12 years. And Duca, startled by the sudden violence of sound and emotion, rushed toward her, his small face etched with concern. I am sorry. Did I cause that? He stammered, his innocent eyes wide. No, it's not you, she choked out, fighting for air, for composure. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. You just look so much like someone I lost. The lie tasted like ash, even as the truth hammered at the inside of her skull, demanding release. He looks exactly like him, a voice shrieked inside her. He is him. And Duca crouched beside her, his small hand hesitantly touching her arm, a gesture of comfort that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. I didn't mean to make you sad, he whispered, his own voice tinged with a child's guilt. Ngazika forced herself to breathe, to wipe the hot tears from her face, to compose a mask of serene sorrow. You didn't, sweetheart, she said, her voice still raw, but imbued with a strange, dawning hope she hadn't felt in over a decade. You reminded me that love never really leaves us. It just changes form. She managed a wobbly smile, a desperate attempt at reassurance, and led him gently to the living room. She made him a toasted bread, cutting the crusts just so, something she hadn't done since forever. He ate slowly, politely, as if afraid to take too much, his hunger clearly battling with an ingrained sense of caution. When she asked where he lived, he told her he stayed at Ozizicare orphanage, his gaze drifting to the ornate grandfather clock in the corner. Sometimes, Nduka said, his voice softer now, a faraway look in his green eyes, I dream about a woman singing. She has soft hands, and she calls me my Obina. I don't know why I dream that. The delicate silverware Ngazika was about to place in the sink clattered to the porcelain. Her world didn't just tilt, it spun violently, throwing her off balance. My Obina. The words echoed with a terrifying precision in the chambers of her memory. The song he described, You Are My Rainbow, was the lullaby she used to sing every single night to her baby boy, her beloved Obina Udoka. A cold dread, mingled with an impossible, blinding hope, washed over her. Her hands trembled so violently she had to brace herself against the counter. Her gaze flew to the mantel, to a small, tarnished silver frame. With a trembling hand, she reached for it, her fingers brushing away years of dust. It was an old photograph, slightly faded, but the image was as vivid in her mind as the day it was taken. Her and her late husband, Uzoma, beaming, holding their newborn son, a tiny swaddled bundle with a shock of dark hair and those same startling green eyes. She carried the photograph back to Nduka, her steps a careful, measured dance against the possibility that this fragile hope would shatter. She placed it gently beside him on the antique coffee table. Do you see anything familiar in this picture, Nduka? She whispered, her voice barely a breath. Nduka leaned closer, his brow furrowed in concentration. His green eyes, so like the baby's in the picture, widened slowly, then faster. A gasp escaped his lips. That's the lady from my dreams, he said in awe, pointing a small finger at Ngazika's younger self. And the baby? He looked from the picture to Ngazika, then back again, a dawning realization spreading across his face. That's me. The awe in his voice was replaced by a profound confusion, a sense of his entire world shifting beneath his feet. Ngazika couldn't hold back the dam anymore. Tears streamed uncontrollably down her face, a torrent of grief and overwhelming joy. Nduka, my darling boy, she choked out, her voice breaking with an exquisite pain, a mother's cry from the depths of her soul. You're Obina. You're my son. He looked at her, his confusion deepening into a silent question. But they told me my family died in an accident. His voice was small, bewildered. She nodded through her tears, the memory still cutting deep. "There was an accident," she said quietly. "Your father, he didn't make it. And they told me you didn't either." Her voice fell into a raw, trembling whisper, threaded with resentment that time had never softened. "They said they never found your body. We searched for weeks, for months. But eventually, they convinced us there was no hope left." A cold dread crept into Ngazika's chest, sharper now than the sorrow she'd lived with for years. The accident, over a decade ago. The police report had been clear. A violent head-on collision, Obina's seat empty, and a small, unrecognizable body pulled from the wreckage. They had identified it only by a tiny silver locket. One Ngazika had once braided into a blanket. "Nduka," Ngazika's voice was barely more than breath. "Do you have anything that belonged to your mother? A photograph, anything at all?" He shook his head, eyes fixed on his worn shoes, loneliness settling over his small frame. "Only this." From his torn backpack, he pulled out a delicate silver chain. The locket hanging from it was bent, tarnished, and almost broken. Etched faintly on the surface was a small, familiar letter. "Oh." Ngazika's breath caught in her throat. A strangled gasp escaped her lips. It was the locket, the one she had given Nduka. And this locket had been found at the crash site. Then whose body had they buried all those years ago? For a long moment, silence filled the room. A heavy, trembling silence, thick with shattered pasts and impossible futures. Nduka stared at her, then at the photograph, then back at her. The truth, so immense and unbelievable, slowly began to settle in his young mind. The dreams, the feeling of never quite belonging, the pull he felt toward this stranger, it all coalesced. Then slowly, almost tentatively, Nduka reached forward, his small arms wrapping around her in a fierce, clumsy embrace. "I think I found you again," he said softly, his voice muffled against her shoulder, a statement of profound simplicity that carried the weight of a universe. Ngazika broke down completely, holding him as if she would never, ever let go. 12 years of pain, of cold emptiness, of a heart frozen in time, dissolved in that single embrace. The walls of the old house, which had heard nothing but the echoes of grief and solitude for so long, finally reverberated with life again, with the sound of a mother's rediscovered love and a son's lost hope found. Later that evening, as twilight deepened and cast long shadows across the porch, they sat together, a comfortable, almost sacred closeness settling between them. Nduka, nestled beside her, told her how he had bounced from one foster home to another, each one feeling like a temporary stop, never a true destination. He spoke of the quiet ache of never knowing where he truly belonged, of feeling a piece of himself missing. Each time someone tried to adopt him, something deep inside him hesitated, an inexplicable resistance, as if waiting for someone else, someone he couldn't name or remember, but whose presence he felt in his very marrow. Ngazika listened, her hand never leaving his, stroking his hair, tracing the familiar curve of his cheek. The horror of what had been done to them, the cruel deception, began to crystallize into a cold, hard resolve. When an hour later she finally called the Ozizikare orphanage, her voice was trembling with both raw fear and unshakable hope. She explained everything, her story pouring out in an urgent torrent. The person on the other end, initially skeptical, grew quiet, then promised to look deeply into his records, hinting that there might be inconsistencies already noted, whispers of a past discrepancy. But Ngazika knew it wasn't just inconsistencies. It was a crime, a stolen life, and she wasn't going to rest until every last piece of the truth, however painful, was unearthed. The journey had just begun, and the world, it seemed, was about to discover the devastating secret Ozizikare orphanage had kept for far too long. Days bled into a week, and the sterile chill of the lab report did little to prepare Ngazika for the emotional tidal wave that crashed over her. The DNA tests confirmed what a mother's instinct, honed by 12 years of agonizing absence, had screamed all along. Nduka, the stranger with haunted eyes who'd appeared on her doorstep, was indeed her long-lost son, Obina Udoka. The memory of that day was etched in her mind with a brutal clarity. She stood outside her house again, the worn porch steps still carrying the phantom weight of his presence. And Duca, no longer a stranger but a miracle made flesh, stood beside her. He held her hand, his grip a silent testament to the years of searching, of longing. "You know," Ngazika began, her voice a fragile tremor, tears blurring the edges of her vision. The sun, a benevolent eye in the sky, cast long shadows across the familiar lawn. "When you first knocked on that day, I remember thinking it was just another lonely afternoon. The same endless cycle of quiet despair. But it wasn't. Oh, and Duca, it wasn't. It was the day God gave me my reason to live again." And Duca looked up, his usually guarded eyes now alight with a fierce, incandescent joy. He'd been a man adrift, a ghost in his own life, until that fateful knock. "I think maybe he gave me water that day too," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Not the kind you drink, Ngazika. The kind that fills your heart. Like a desert finding an oasis." Ngazika's laughter was a choked sob, a release of 12 years of pent-up grief and hope. She pulled him into a fierce embrace, burying her face in his shoulder. "Oh, my sweet boy," she murmured, her words muffled. "You filled mine too. Every empty space, every ache, you filled it all." As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in strokes of molten gold and fiery crimson, it seemed to wrap the reunited mother and son in a halo of warmth. It was a second chance, a glorious, unexpected dawn after a seemingly endless night. That evening, for the first time in 12 years, Ngazika set 2 plates at the dinner table. The silence of the house was no longer a suffocating blanket of loneliness, but a soft hum of anticipation. And this time, both plates were filled with the comfort of home-cooked food and the even greater comfort of shared presence. Later, as she tucked him into the bed where he had once slept as a child, Ngazika hummed the old lullaby, the one she'd sung to him before he was stolen from her life. And Duca's eyelids fluttered, his breath deep and even. "I knew I'd find you one day," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of a lifetime of searching, of a faith that had never truly died. "Even when I didn't know who I was looking for, I knew you were out there." Ngazika brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead, her touch feather-light, reverent. She leaned down and pressed a kiss to his temple, a promise whispered into the night. "And I knew I'd hear that knock again," she breathed, her voice thick with unshed tears. "The one that brings life back to my heart. The one that banishes the shadows." Outside, the quiet town of Ozizikare Road slept peacefully, oblivious to the seismic shift that had occurred within its unassuming borders. But inside that little house, 2 broken souls, fractured by loss and time, had finally found their way home. All because a thirsty, lost boy, driven by an instinct he couldn't explain, had dared to knock on the right door. Sometimes the smallest of acts, a knock, a question, a simple request for a drink of water, are not mere coincidences. They are divine threads, woven by a power far greater than ourselves, reconnecting souls that were never truly meant to be apart. Love, Ngazika knew, never truly dies. It simply waits, patient and persistent, finding its way home when the time is finally, beautifully right.
Hello, champions. I hope you enjoyed our stories. Please hit the like button, leave a comment below, and subscribe to our channel to help us grow.